Hello, my name is Robin Miller, Deputy Superintendent for School Support and Accountability at the State Department of Education. Trauma can impact anyone. It has no boundaries. It can happen at any time, and the effects of adverse childhood experiences reach far beyond the initial traumatic event. For children, traumatic experiences can and often do directly impact their ability to learn. We know that learning cannot take place if students don't feel safe. Part of our role as educators is to make sure that children feel safe. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological needs like food and clothing, as well as the need for safety, must be met before higher needs like belonging, esteem, and self-actualization can be dealt with. Trauma removes our ability to feel safe. Until we're given the help we need to work through this trauma in a healthy way, we cannot properly respond to a learning environment. Our ability to pursue goals and self-actualize is impaired by our trauma. With this in mind, it makes sense that a child who has experienced trauma may not perform well in school. They may act out or be unresponsive. They may show difficulty staying on the same level as the rest of the class. Alternatively, they may believe that school is a safer place for them and seek out adults they can trust. In any case, it is vital that we respond to the suspected trauma with compassion and take action to mitigate its effects as early as possible. Reporting suspected trauma is only the first step. Individualized learning that takes a child's specific trauma into account is an important aspect of helping them heal. In order to teach effectively, we need to meet the needs of our students. Acknowledging trauma and acting to prevent and mitigate it is one more way we can meet those needs. Visit this website to learn more about adverse childhood experiences and what you can do to help children thrive in the face of trauma. For more information, contact the Office of School Safety and Security by either phone or email, or visit our page at the Oklahoma State Department of Education website. Hello.
Cindy, you're muted, ma'am.
Okay, we'll try that again. Thank you for attending our trauma webinar for the Office of School Safety and Security, and a special thank you to those of you that actually took the time to attend. We know it's spring break and it's hard, but we always do the third Thursday of every month, and this one, as well as all of our other webinars, are housed on our School Safety and Security website. So we encourage you to encourage others to take a time and go in and view this. So this one is trauma webinar, and with us we have our guests, Dr. Erika Olinger and Trisha Goga, and they'll introduce themselves in just a minute. So, okay, Jason. Okay, so this is our team at the Office of School Safety and Security. We have Mr. John Parker as our Executive Director, and there I am. And then we have Michael Ann Uten and Jason Gray. And Jason is the one who's heard speak up and tell me that my mic was mute. He's our IT guy, and he kind of runs this whole thing for us. So we really appreciate that. Michael Ann comes to us from the emergency management side, where she came to us as the former executive director for Oklahoma Emergency Management, so she brings a wealth of information there. Jason, as I said, is a former educator, and so he brings that education lens and view. Steve Lynch, there, he is a former educator coach, and as well as myself, a former school administrator, and John was a former school administrator. So we all come from the lens of school safety and security. And then the infamous Lindsay Moore down at the bottom, she's kind of the glue that holds it all together. We couldn't get anything done if it wasn't for Lindsay. So if you need anything for school safety and security, training, professional development, want us to come out and do a short, simple walkthrough and assessment, or help with your EOP, feel free to contact any of us. Michael Ann and Jason typically do Western Oklahoma. Steve and I typically do Eastern Oklahoma, but we often intermingle. So reach out and get a hold of us all. Okay. So, as you know, when it comes to trauma, some content or the discussion of certain items may trigger traumatic responses, and we just want you to please exercise self-care. If something is triggered and you need help, in the chat you can private message Erika or Trisha, either one. Okay. So our upcoming webinars, we have 2 left in this series. April 15th is about communication, and when a crisis occurs, we know communication is key, right? Who are we going to communicate to? How are we going to do that? So that's a really good one, as well as May 20th, cybersecurity, and talk about that digital footprint. It's now actually called a digital tattoo because a footprint can be washed away easily or wiped away, but a digital tattoo is more permanent. And so just a play on words there, you know, words change all the time, but we do invite you to come to those next 2. Okay. So if you have any professional development needs, please go to our website. We have there, or contact me, and we'll get that scheduled at any school. And you can either email me or call me, and we'll be happy to get that set up. So okay, Jason. So as we move on into get ready to talk about our crisis and emergency or this trauma section. First of all, before I introduce our speakers here, I want to talk just a minute about why trauma and school safety and security. Well, we know the drill stress, right? And those of us who've been in school, you know, I was in school 31 years, and you talk about that drill stress. In the spring, we may have 3 days of supercells that are coming down the pike, and we have to monitor them. We're constantly watching the weather. And by day 3, when nothing is happening, we say, okay, whatever. And then what if something bad does happen? So drill stress, drill trauma, we don't know what students, what staff have experienced in their former lives. So if we do an active assailant drill or exercise, we don't know how that's going to affect students. And so we need to be very cognizant and be aware anytime we do a fire drill, whatever, that we process it afterwards. We just don't go back into the classroom and start all over. But one of the different things can trigger, colors can trigger if something else has happened. Incidents can trigger someone, and how that works into school safety. So I was at a school and we were doing a school safety training with their leadership team, and the chef at the school was in there. And we were talking about active assailant training and how we need to be aware of trauma, and maybe make that, if we're doing just a staff training, maybe make them an opt-out. Like someone can say, I don't want to be a part of this. I can't be part of this active training. And he actually held up his hand and he said, thank you so much for making sure that my administration knows that we have the right to opt out, or should have the right to opt out, because he went to school in California and he was actually involved in an active shooter situation. And he said, just me as Cindy Swearington from School Safety and Security was talking to his team, he was becoming visibly agitated, sitting in his seat, moving around and blinking and you know, sweating. And he said, the thought of me having to go through an active assailant training, he said, was terrifying. He said, I would quit my job before I had to go through that in that kind of depth. And so it's important that we are just aware that trauma exists and how do we prepare for that. So with that, we brought in 2 of our best, our greatest treasures that we have at the State Department of Education, Dr. Erika Olinger and Trisha Goga. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you 2, and you guys can introduce yourself, and then we're just going to have an interview session, if you don't mind. I'll ask a few questions, and participants, if you have any participants, please let me know. Put them in the chat, and we'll be sure and try to get to some of those questions at the end of the webinar. So Dr. Olinger, Trisha, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and to the whole safety and security team for inviting us to be a part of the conversation today. And we're just so thankful for the collaborative relationship that we have with your office, and the ability to work together for Oklahoma schools and children. And I just want to echo what Cindy said. So thankful for the participants today and taking time on your spring break to join us. And please ask us questions as you need to in the chat. I'll be brief on the introductions. I'm Erika Olinger, and I'm a school psychologist by training. So my education and most of my work in schools has been as a school psychologist, former special education administrator as well. and was happy to join OSDE a little over a year ago with my colleague Trisha Goga to make up the crisis team. So we'd love to have a conversation about trauma today and how that is instrumental in our safety and security practices. And then at the end, assuming we have time, we'd love to tell you a little bit more about our team.
Hi, everyone, and I'm so glad you're here as well. My name is Trisha Goga. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist and registered behavior technician. And like Dr. Olinger said, we came on board about a little over a year ago in January, and kind of the timing was quite perfect with everything that has gone on. And we hope to give you a little more information about our office and our team and some of the resources that we can provide, as well as answer any of your questions. And from there, I think we're ready to kind of jump into the topic.
Okay, well, let's just go. Oh, someone want to talk about this, or is this?
So Jason, I think if you want to hold the PowerPoint here, but take it off for a little bit, we're just going to have a conversation. And if we have time at the end, if you'll pull these slides back up right here, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just throw this out there, and you guys can pick and choose who takes these questions. But why is it important for schools to consider trauma-based or trauma-related issues as part of their larger school safety and crisis team training?
Well, I loved your video to start off our meeting. Dr. Miller did an amazing job kind of introducing what trauma is, but it's the exposure to an incident that can have that lasting adverse effect. And so why we want to have that trauma or consider trauma in our crisis planning and response is we want to really balance that physical and psychological safety. The physical being, the structures of the school environment, which are very unique. And then also that with that psychological safety, which sometimes is a piece that's missing, and that's the students and staff emotional well-being. And so there's things that we can do ahead of time and proactively, and then things that we can do in our response piece. And what we know from research is that increased school safety, including that psychological safety, is impacts the students and staff and helps them to be more successful post-crisis, and it actually can lead to long-term healthy outcomes if you have those pieces as a part of your safety and crisis teams.
And I think I would just add to that part of preparedness is being trauma informed, and you can be trained in that to a very extensive degree, but just starting out, it's just recognizing that many people have experienced trauma, and just as a safety team, as a crisis team, knowing that people have experienced trauma and just being mindful of that and providing people with tools and with ideas to be able to cope in stressful situations. So not just to have, the raw instructions, which are important, and the plans, which are critical, but to infuse in that the knowledge that they're going to need some tools to help cope. And so I think at the end, we're going to drop in some resources in the chat related to some trainings we can do on trauma-informed practices, but it's even just things like having SEL curriculum, social emotional learning curriculum, as a part of your school, or having restorative discipline practices, being mindful to be teaching students and staff about resiliency and hope as just part of your school culture. Sometimes it's just in the way that we talk to our students and staff. So it's using language in a specific example. If you're going through a particular crisis or traumatic experience, an example might be that you really shouldn't say something like, it's going to be okay, we're all going to be okay, and making promises that we can't keep, or that maybe students and staff have heard before and it turns out that they weren't okay. And so it's just having that shift to saying something in my example that I just gave, something more like, the adults or the safety team in the building are utilizing our plan to keep us all as safe as possible, or we have a plan and we are doing our best to execute that plan so we can all stay as safe as we can. And those are small changes, but it's ways to allow people to cope through the lens of the current trauma, but also their previous trauma. And to me, the biggest piece of being trauma informed is just relationships, and relationships. So having a school community where all of your staff feel connected to kids and other staff members, where students feel like they have adults who care about them, that in itself goes so far to being just trauma informed.
Thank you. Thank you both. That is great. And as you said, that language of trauma is just, we as educators are used to saying, it's okay, you know, we're going to be okay. If we're not okay, and if it's not okay, and we've made false promises, like you said, we've kind of set ourselves and our children up for failure. So thank you very much. Thank you both for it. Okay, so another question that we have is, what are some ways that schools can be trauma aware in their crisis planning and preparedness efforts?
So I think one of the, again, one of the first steps would really just to go through your crisis plans, go through your EOPs, look at each of your annexes and all of your plans, and just say, okay, not only did we filter this through a physical safety lens, but now how can we filter it also for psychological safety? And how can we plan for psychological safety in our crisis plans? I've seen some that actually include a mental health annex, which speaks specifically to creating not just a physically safe school, but what are we doing to support our students and staff emotionally, psychologically, mental health wise? And that's part of their overall safety plan, is that we recognize that people need to feel safe in order to be safe. And we know our buildings can be virtual fortresses and be as physically safe as possible and have every preventative measure in place. But if people don't feel safe in that fortress and it doesn't feel safe to them, then those measures don't mean very much. So I think just going through each part of your plan and evaluating how could we make this safer or more emotionally compatible with our folks who may have experienced trauma. And if you don't know, then another great tip is representation on your crisis and safety teams. So have some experts who know about trauma. To the extent that they're comfortable, ask students and staff who've experienced trauma, hey, evaluate this with us. Tell us what could make this better, what would make it more safe. So Cindy's example about just talking to that chef and having his input into what can we do to make this drill be more safe? It can still be effective, but what can we do to make it more safe? So also just partnering with community agencies to help with that as well. So again, we at the OSDE can help with some of those pieces. And there's other community mental health agencies or other places that could be a good addition to your team.
Some other things to consider is just having individual safety and crisis plans for individuals who may have a pre-existing trauma history or that have some risk factors that might show that they, or might allude to the fact that they might be more traumatized than others on a drill or an exercise or even after a crisis. That could be students with specific needs or staff with specific needs, those that are on IEPs or 504 plans, but it doesn't have to be just those individuals. It can be anyone that just has that maybe pre-existing trauma history that you know about. So maybe creating plans for those individuals and groups. Also just taking into account drills and exercises with a trauma lens and kind of talking through different scenarios and how that might be more traumatizing and maybe lightening it for some folks going through the drill or the exercise. And then also just considering policies and procedures with a trauma-informed lens. And that includes some of the things that you guys are doing in your Office of Safety and Security with your EOP planning and your behavioral threat assessment planning and management. Those, I know that you guys have included all that trauma-informed pieces in those. And so I think schools, if they are listening to this and need help with those areas, they have a great kind of starting place for you and can help with those things.
Okay, so I love what you said about looking at our drills through a trauma-informed lens. And we can do that simply from what I'm hearing is like if we have a tornado warning or the clouds are dark and it's thunder, maybe we don't need to go ahead and go through with our tornado drill on that particular day, right? Or days reunification in Egypt. But what about, you talked about those individual plans. What about, and sometimes our building, the school building is the home. So what about the drills when kids are at home through that home-based learning? Can you speak just a minute about that?
So are you asking how to conduct a drill if they're on a distance learning procedure? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So I think that's a really good question. And of course, that's relevant right now. I think we're all hopeful that COVID-19 might be on the downslide, but I think we would be silly to think that that means that distance learning is going away. I think from here on out, there's going to be a subset of the population that will engage in distance learning. And it's important that they know if they do return to the building, what a drill could look like, and if they're at home, what that should look like. And so I think it's always important to be mindful of just always keep in the back of our minds, what is the purpose of these drills and exercises? And it's truly to prepare our staff and our students to have a plan, but better yet, to have competency to make decisions to keep people safe. And so it's really, the end goal is for people to feel capacity to make decisions that will keep them safe. And so I always like to say, you don't have to traumatize people to know that they're going to be traumatized in a drill. So creating the situation as close to possible isn't necessary. And in fact, that might be detrimental to people actually being able to learn and process and take in information. And so just think about when you're in a heightened state, if you're really scared or you're really mad or you're really sad, anytime we're in a heightened place, that's not our best time for learning. And the drills need to be a place for learning and for capacity. And so I think there's some ways that we can do that that might be non-traditional from our typical ways of running our fire drills and our tornado drills and our active shooter exercises. And one that I just really think is beneficial, and particularly if you have a population with high trauma, or a school that's experienced a tornado, for example, is really through the use of what we call tabletop exercises. And that's where we sit down and we, through a structured series of scenarios, talk through what we would do. And it's almost like you're practicing with your mind, but not necessarily as much with your body as you might in a traditional drill. And it seems like that wouldn't be as effective. Well, if we don't get up and practice exiting the room, or if we don't duck under those desks, we're not going to know how to do that. But what the research increasingly shows is that tabletop exercises are just as effective. And sometimes when they do post-tests, both students and staff actually get more answers correct because they're learning. They're in that place where I'm calm, I'm able to think through this, and then it becomes muscle memory to the extent that when it's time to make that decision, they know what to do. So I think tabletops for those students and staff who are in distance learning right now can be just as effective. You can do that in a virtual environment, but I would also advocate for that again, if it's a population that has a lot of trauma. That would also be appropriate if you're in buildings physically, but you're following social distance requirements, or COVID otherwise maybe prevents you from being really close together in your tornado rooms. If it's not truly a tornado and some of those things, I would advocate for those tabletop activities. And I feel like maybe I talked all the way around your question, Cindy, and I hope that I actually hit it on the head. The other piece, and I think you mentioned this at the beginning, Cindy, is with those tabletops, that allows for debrief. And that's critical, whether you're doing a traditional drill or a tabletop drill, whether you're virtual or in person, is sitting down after and not just doing the drill for the sake of doing it, but to treat it as an assessment exercise, to then come back to the table and say, which parts did we do well? Which parts can we improve on? Which parts are people still confused about? And you can add the question, which parts brought on more trauma than necessary for the purposes of learning? And how could we change that or shape that so that we're still getting those skills and still getting capacity, but we're not traumatizing people in the meantime?
Erika, I'm so glad you said that about the debrief, because being in a school, I don't remember there being very many debriefs. And so you do, if you think about tabletop activities, you do have that debrief almost ingrained within the exercise itself because you're talking through it and talking about the different scenarios and the different things that could happen or how you should address it. And so I love that you mentioned debrief, not just for drills themselves, but also in connection to that tabletop, because tabletops would be a really good way to include your virtual students and their families, because if you're doing it via Zoom, you've had those scenarios and you can talk through it just like we're talking through things like right now.
Mhm.
Thank you for saying that. And we teach that out as well. So I'm glad that we're doing the right thing. But after you have a drill, don't just go back. Just don't go back to teaching science or math. Really take some time to discuss that. Let the adult process. And sometimes I think we forget about the adults in the book. We're focused on doing what's right for the kids, which is what we're there for. But we have adults have trauma too. So sometimes we need to know that. And we need to be aware. And you mentioned relationships. Know your staff and know your people. It's important that we all know maybe what the other trauma may have had. And if we're having a tornado drill, or even the real deal, a bad weather, we need to know who has experienced or who may have triggered based on that weather, and then just help pay attention to them. That kind of everybody's listening. Thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah. And I would just say, Cindy, you know, a tornado, if there is a true weather event like a tornado, is not the time to find out that your staff might have a trauma reaction. And again, that goes back to your planning. And so if Erika is a staff member who had experienced that previously, part of the crisis planning might be that there's somebody else to help support her classroom in those instances, because we have a suspicion that her previous trauma history may not make her effective to lead the students where they need to go. And that's okay. I mean, that's being mindful of people's different histories. But again, that comes back to inform our plan of what do we need to do to help support Erika's class. And I think just preparing students and staff for what to expect during those drills, and high intensity drills in particular, it's going to allow them to express their discomfort to you. It's going to allow them to decline to participate if they need to. And what that really does is strengthens your plan, because that tells you where some of your, I don't want to say gaps in a negative way, but where you need some more support to be effective when the real event does happen.
Right. Thank you so much. That was great. Love hearing that. And again, we teach out that buddy process in our training. So here's another question. What about response? Are there specific strategies for how we need to be trauma informed after an impact?
Well, to piggyback with what Erika just said, or Dr. Olinger had just said, and then also to kind of answer this question, but we actually practice what we preach. So in our crisis response team, we actually have already we do an assessment with our own individuals that come out and assist schools and we have determined, you know, what triggering events they have, so that if we do have a tornado, for instance, and someone has experience with that, we don't want to necessarily maybe send them out. So that's kind of that proactive piece that we've already done. But then going into the response piece, the one thing that I can say is that you want to triage, and that is that the response piece, we call it triage, but and it's using risk factors that we know about and warning signs and things, and the risk factors could be assessed through a vulnerability assessment proactively. But if not, we can kind of, once we see some warning signs, we can maybe look into the risk factors. But triaging, and also documenting your triaging efforts. And what I mean by triage is if we have students and staff that are more highly affected by the event or the series of events, documenting those individuals, touching base with them, and then determining what their needs are. And it is at its core a multi-tiered systems of support. And you are triaging in order to determine which level of support the students and staff need. And this could be after a drill or an exercise, but also after a crisis situation. And so you can do it both. And if you're doing it in your planning efforts, and you're already familiar with that process, then after a traumatic event, then it becomes natural for you to assess the students and staff afterward. And so there is actually some resources we'll put in the chat box that you might be able to utilize in your triaging efforts. But other things is just to understand typical trauma reactions. So there are, when someone experiences a traumatic event, and there's common reactions that happen, that occur for different developmental ages. And those are, there's normal reactions to traumatic events. And with those normal reactions, we want to help the students and staff process those and get on a path toward recovery through adaptive coping skills. And then when we know that students or staff are maybe engaging in maladaptive skills, maladaptive coping skills, then we want to maybe get them some additional supports and check in with them. And then that may be some warning signs that they need higher levels of support than just that one check-in. Let's see. We also want to consider just the just because a student or staff has experienced a traumatic event or has gone through an exercise or drill does not mean that they're going to become traumatized. And it's all about the student and staff's perception. And that's something that I think kind of has gotten lost with all that we're going through with COVID. So I'm going to give an example. So I know a lot of people are talking about the reactions of this pandemic and what has occurred. And there's a wide range of families and individuals that have been impacted. Some have been no one that they've lost from this pandemic, where there's others, they've maybe lost multiple family members or friends due to the pandemic. So there's a wide range of developmental traumatic reactions. And those reactions and those perceptions of the event are really what is going to trigger those responses. And so it's all about perception. And if I can leave the audience with anything, it's just recognizing that just because someone's gone through a traumatic event, for instance, the pandemic, doesn't mean that everyone is going to become traumatized because they've gone through it. And it's about the perception of that event itself. We also want to consider the reunification process. So within that multi-tiered systems of support, one of the first things you do is you want to reunify the students and staff with their families and caregivers. And that actually is, it leads into that social support, which is one of the first things you do when you're responding to an event, is you're reunifying the families. And then that reunification serves as kind of like your first intervention of getting people together with their social support. And that social support, sometimes it's the only thing that you need, is to be reunited with your family. Your family is going to provide that safe haven for you. And that's really all you need. And you can process that with them. Whereas other individuals might need higher levels of care or support. Let's see. We also really want to consider in this response piece, the returning to normalcy, returning to the school building. That in and of itself is also going to be part of that. You want to establish that social support. You getting back to school and coming back and having a daily routine is very, very helpful. It's helpful for students. We know that just from experience, but it's also helpful for adults to have a routine, to know what's expected, and to know, and it kind of puts you toward a path toward recovery, is that things are going to get to be okay. It might be rocky right now, but there's supports in place, and there's a long-term, you have a life that you can lead after this. Life is going to come back to maybe not completely normal, but it's going to come back to where you can be more stable. Let's see, making sure I hit all that. Response is such a big piece. So I'm like making sure I address everything. You also, your interventions. So I talk about those levels of support. So if you do get to you have individuals or groups of individuals that need additional supports, we want to make sure that those supports and those interventions provided are done with a trauma-informed lens, and that if you do groups, your groups are groups that make sense, and they are considering all the different variables. You don't want to stick students together just willy-nilly. You want to be really strategic in that planning piece. Sometimes it's those classrooms are a good starting place, but it may be where you had a couple of individuals that weren't there that day. And during, sorry, my dog just barked. When you're doing your exercise, if you had a couple students that were gone that day, when you debrief, they may not need to be, it could be a part of the debrief, but if you have students that are experiencing some traumatic reactions from having those drills or experiencing a crisis, then you may not include those individuals that were missing in that group, because they don't have that, they have a different lens. They weren't there, they didn't see it. And so you might have a different conversation with them. You also really want to talk about and address how to teach. Well, you just want to look through teaching and the resiliency skills that you want to see, because again, I talked about maladaptive and adaptive coping skills. Some of our students, and even some of our, they don't have those adaptive coping skills naturally within them. They haven't learned them over the years. And so teaching those types of skills, the adaptive skills, will help combat the maladaptive skills, maladaptive coping mechanisms that we see sometimes after a traumatic event or a drill. And then other considerations just to keep in mind with a trauma-informed lens is memorializations and compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. So those are two topics in and of themselves that could be a day-long conversation. So I'm not going to go too much into those, but if you want additional resources over those two topics, we have a lot on our webpage.
Yeah, I just think understanding the take home would be, don't assume what the response is going to be, and practice knowing how to triage and match your level of intervention to what folks need is huge. And then I would also just echo caring for yourselves as leaders in the work, and just being familiar with what compassion fatigue looks like, what secondary trauma looks like, and how you support the people that are supporting the work.
And thank you both so much for bringing that. So as a former school administrator, as both counselor, principal, teacher, superintendent, all that. So in my career, I've experienced 11 deaths in my time in my school system, and some students, some staff, and it's tough. And one that really resonates with me was when I was middle school principal, and she passed away on a trail riding incident, right? And I did all the right things. I thought I brought in counselors, take care of the kids. I brought in counselors, take care of the staff. And I was just running. And 3 days in, I collapsed. And I came in and told my husband, I'm done. I'm going to quit. I can't handle it. I wasn't taking care of myself. I was too busy taking care of everybody else. So that compassion fatigue, I thought, I can't go through this again. And I needed to prepare myself and train myself that it was okay. I may have to go through it again, but I can get through it. And so that is just so important. And yeah, and that memorial piece, how long do you plant a tree, or do you grow a forest? You know, because you don't know how many times you're going to have to do that. And we know every trauma is not detriment. It's not tornadoes. It's not deaths. We have those hidden traumas that kids deal with, parents deal with, teachers, staff deal with. And so just the overview of how we deal with trauma and work through a trauma lens is so important, because that trauma, that person may not walk into the school building with a sign above their head saying, I'm traumatized too, this, that, that. We don't know. And so thank you so much for that. So on that, training of staff and teaching staff to just basically go through the day with the trauma-informed lens, what training would the two of you recommend for schools?
So Jason, I think if we have time, now might be the time to bring up the PowerPoint, and we can drop some of these in the box. But of course, the Oklahoma State Department of Education has many professional development opportunities to help your schools become trauma informed in general. And so if this is, the first time that you're recognizing, oh, we need to do some more work in this area, and I'd like for my staff to be more trauma informed, then they can start really with some of those basics, which is perfectly appropriate. And our teams are very good at meeting you where you're at. And maybe you've got some pieces in place, but you feel like there's other ways to improve. So specifically through the Departments of Prevention and the Department of Counseling, which is in our Student Support Division, they have different ways that you can be trained or inform yourself, and lots of resources. And so I'm hoping, yes, Trisha is dropping those in the box right now. And then of course, this team right here with safety and security. So if you want to look at your EOPs and make those emergency plans more trauma informed and make sure you're balancing physical and psychological safety, they can do those pieces for you. Again, if you just want to walk through and you want someone to come and kind of help you with a vulnerability assessment or take a look at what we have, I'm sure that they would be happy to do that as well. And then I think Trisha's going to start us off a little bit about what the crisis team and what we can provide in terms of training and support, and a little bit about what we do. And then we'll try to get through it quickly so we can leave some time for questions.
So the first thing I want to talk about is the part in red. So that number is our crisis call line. So if your school or your district has experienced a crisis where you need some support, which we'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit, call this number. It's monitored 24/7, and we can help talk you through, collaborate with you, determine what needs you have, and help to be able to provide some resources for you if you have experienced a crisis event. But overall, the crisis team, we work with school districts in all phases of crisis management: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And we actually work very closely with our friends in Office of Safety and Security, because they do a lot of that, the prevention piece, the EOP planning, behavioral threat assessment management. And so we work very collaboratively. So sometimes we're throwing something to them because it's really more in their wheelhouse, and sometimes they're throwing something to us, but because we want to work as a team. And we address hazard and threat-based crises. And I mean, I think the last number that we had was 59 responses between January of 2020 and today, was 29 responses, school responses. So, and we've seen a wide range of school crises. We've seen anything from student and staff death to suicides to COVID-related deaths to natural disasters and other things like that. So we've seen it all. I know that our friends in Office of Safety and Security, they've seen a lot of things too. And we want to be able to support you guys in whatever you need. Next slide, please. I want to let you know where we are being funded from. So OSDE got a grant from the Department of Justice, and it's called the Stop School Violence Grant. And it was awarded in October of 2019. And this grant is in partnership with the Oklahoma Safety and Security Institute and the Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management. The grant is managed through the Office of Student Support, which is what Dr. Olinger and myself work out of, but we work very collaboratively, again, with our friends in Office of School Safety and Security, because we know that our work is intermingled, and we want to make sure that we provide comprehensive supports to school districts, and that's why we collaborate so much with them. Next page. Okay. And then this is how we can help. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. So we can do trainings and professional development, specifically Prepare. Prepare is a crisis response curriculum that's research, it's evidence-based, resource-rich, and it's very comprehensive. And Erika, Dr. Olinger is actually going to talk about that after this slide. So you'll get a little more information about that. We also have been doing a lot of guidance documents and helping to frame, put some things in place in Oklahoma that schools and districts can utilize if they so choose to do so. And one of those is an Oklahoma Comprehensive School Crisis Management Framework. And then the other one is a suicide resource guide for Oklahoma schools, prevention, intervention, and postvention. And those two guidance documents are going to have a lot of resources that you can utilize in your own planning, and just have some best practices that you could utilize in your school and determine what you need and don't need from those documents. And then we also, again, like I said, we can help respond to a crisis, and that is through assistance and collaboration. It could be resource support. So maybe we call you and you don't, we talk on the phone and you don't need physical support, but we might send you an email with some resources that you might look over. We can do crisis collaboration. So we've talked and we've met with schools via Zoom multiple times to kind of collaborate, see what their needs are, and then kind of talk through the process and kind of get them on the maybe a first or second step of how to respond to that crisis event, how to support their community. We also can come and provide the same support in person, and respond and help with that triage piece, triaging of individuals and staff. And then we also can help connect the school and community resources to community resources. And then our motto is as little or as much as needed. So with whatever the school or district needs, or even if you're a classroom teacher and you want some resources on how to address something that's happening in your classroom, we'd be happy to talk to you as well, and talk you through kind of how to talk to your students at a developmentally appropriate level. But yeah, so as little as or as much needed support as you would need. Next slide. Thank you. And then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Olinger.
Oh, thanks, Trisha. And I'm going to go through these next ones rather quickly, but anyone that would like access to this PowerPoint or these materials, of course, we're happy to share. But our one of the things that our grant asks us to do and that we have really started picking up on is training and what we call the NAS Prepare crisis management training system. And so Prepare, if you really want to shore up your crisis response from prevention all the way through the recovery pieces, then Prepare is a curriculum written by the National Association of School Psychologists. And so it has input from administrators, from teachers, from school psychologists and counselors, and people who work in schools, and what to do for crisis management. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the highlights. Jason, if you can move to the next one. But Prepare is an acronym, and you can see here on this slide that the curriculum focuses on the prevention pieces and how you can prevent and prepare for crises, again, in the development of EOPs and drills and other pieces. Threaded throughout, it talks about, again, that physical safety balanced with psychological safety. So that's one of the features that we really like, especially on today's topic of a trauma-informed lens. The entire curriculum looks at crisis management through that lens. When Trisha was speaking about triage, the second workshop in particular gives you specific tools for how to do that. If that just sounds, I wouldn't know where to start with that triage piece. Prepare gives you specific tools and strategies to do that, as well then as for the P&R, the actual interventions themselves. So what might those look like, particularly for those that are providing the mental health support to students and staff. And then the E is the examine piece, where it's all very data-driven and data-based, and it teaches teams, again, after a drill, after an event, while we're planning, how do we use data to make our systems more effective? And so we offer that through 2 workshops. The parts highlighted in green are really covered in workshop 1. And I think Trisha's dropping those in the box for us now. And those things colored in orange are really covered in workshop 2. And you don't have to take them both, and you don't have to take them in order, but we have some information about that. Next slide, please. So we just like it for Oklahoma schools, again, because it's comprehensive. It's going to give you tools and language to be consistent, not only within your building, but when you are interfacing with other first responders and community supports that might be helping during a time of crisis. It's based in a multi-tiered systems of support model, which we know is an excellent educational model for delivering services. Next slide, please. For now, it's free to districts. So this is a professional development that we're able to provide through our grant. And so you get the resources, the training, and all of those pieces for free when you come through our office, at least for the extent of the grant. We have about 8 or 9 districts that are scheduling throughout the spring and into the summer. So please contact us if you are interested. And then it's also meant to be sustainable in districts. So once you've gone through the training, or your staff have, they can then become trainers, just like Trisha and I'm a trainer, and they could do that same thing, because the intent is not for the knowledge to stay at OSDE. It's for districts to have capacity to become Prepare trained and then train internally and keep that momentum. And it just supports other initiatives that you're likely working on, like improving safety and security, improving your school climate, and doing that social emotional learning part. Next slide, please. Also, just it's meant for school people, and so it's developed with kiddos in mind, and with staff, and with what a school building and a school day looks like. And it's also mindful of those cultural, developmental, and religious considerations. And so it's meant to be something where you can take your population of students and staff, and Prepare can apply to those different populations, and you can be mindful of equity and of developmentally appropriate practices. I think our safety and security team can tell you that we try to keep it interactive. There's a lot of role play, examples, tabletops, and so it's not just meant for it to be a lecture style, but especially if you come with a team, you're supposed to be able to interact and actually do some of your crisis planning work and get some experience. Lots of resources. Again, we focus on caring for the caregiver throughout, and all those that complete the training do go on our National Association of School Psychologists registry as having completed the training. So you get a designation at the end from NASP. And that was just the tip of the iceberg for Prepare, and hopefully you'll contact us if you want more information. Also, though, know that through our office, we also provide, if you can't commit to a full Prepare training, but you just need something specific for your district, a half-day training, an hour training, a virtual training. These are just some of the other offerings that we've provided to schools and districts in the last year. And so if any of these seem more appropriate for where you're at, just feel free to reach out for those as well. Next slide, please. And then also, we also can just provide technical assistance to your crisis management planning as well. Next slide, please. The last thing I do want to mention is just that in addition to our professional development offerings, I think Trisha mentioned that we are also a crisis response team, and these are 22 of our friends. Some of them may look familiar, like Mr. John Parker in the front, and Cindy's in there. The whole safety and security team joined us last summer, and we had a masked up, socially distanced 4 days of training. And so we have the capacity at OSDE to help you in your crisis response. So call that number, that red number, and Trisha can put that in the box again. We deployed as many as 8 of our folks out to help with some of our larger scale crises. It's possible if you're in the eastern side of the state or the western side of the state that someone on this team could get to you before Trisha and I could. And so the intent is for OSDE to provide, again, as little or as much support as needed to districts. So please feel free to call us, and we're just real happy and proud of this team and all the people on it that represent the work we're doing. And I think, last thing, and then we'll wrap it up. We do have a newsletter. It's for our whole counseling and mental health integration division at OSDE, but every month you'll see featured a crisis article that Trisha and I write about. And so please sign up for that. And then any day now, when our print shop is back up and going at OSDE, I hope you will. We're going to try to do some mass mailings of these crisis cards. We would love it if you would post it in places where people that could use it can see it. So post it in your lounges and in your offices or anywhere else that can be beneficial. I think then that wraps it up. Here's our contact information. And Cindy, I don't know if we have just a minute or two for some pressing questions, or what kind of wrap up you can be helpful with.
So I don't think there's any questions. There's some thank yous in the chat, so people appreciate what you say. And so for me, kind of the takeaway that I'm seeing is every trauma is not necessarily a crisis, right? And what's a crisis to me is not necessarily a crisis to you.
Mhm.
And so maybe, but that doesn't minimize my crisis and my trauma any less. And sometimes that just needs to be acknowledged. And so you go back to the relationships, right? Just that acknowledge that I have that trauma, and just that acknowledgement, and just that knowledge of and relationship building is just so important. And you guys have provided us so much information, and it's so needed. And as you said, it works well, right? And when we develop our emergency operation plans for schools, if they want to take their mental health or their trauma piece a little deeper, we'll certainly transfer them over to you guys. So we work really well. I know at the end, we will have some evaluations coming out where you can receive a certificate of professional development of attendance. And Lindsay's going to take care of those. And so she has the emails of those who registered and were actually in attendance. But those of you who are in attendance, if you know of someone who wants to watch this, we actually had a superintendent reach out to us on our webinar system during the ice storm and the crazy snow. And that was one of their professional development days. And so he was going to have all of his staff kind of come in and pick and choose a variety of webinars from the SDE, and wanted to know if he could get certificates of attendance. So we'll certainly work with you. Yes, he just emailed a list of his teachers who attended watched some of our webinars, and we'll send out those professional development certificates. So we want to help you, Oklahoma schools, in any way that we can. And just to kind of echo what Dr. Olinger and Trisha have said, we're here for you. We're non-compliance. We're only interacting or at your schools if you call us and ask us to help and show up. So with that, I don't believe there are any questions in the chat. We thank you so much, and we hope to see you next month on our communications piece. Thanks for watching, guys. Thank you,
Thanks
Dr.
for having us, Cindy.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.